Hello, dear listener. Welcome back. Please set your volume just low enough to be soft in your ears. Lie down, close your eyes, and let the quiet carry you. Together, we will slowly drift into sleep. Tonight, we begin with the first story in our series of boring history for sleep, the long marches of Napoleon's soldiers. If you enjoy this calm journey, please give the video a like, and remember to subscribe so you never miss another night of gentle history. Now let us begin. When people speak of Napoleon, they often recall grand battles, decisive victories, or the image of a small man with a large ambition standing before vast armies. Yet behind those moments of glory, there were thousands upon thousands of quiet, repetitive days that blurred into one another, days of endless marching across rough ground, days of slow movement through dust, mud, and snow. These were the days lived by his soldiers, and it was these long marches that filled most of their lives, more than the brief flashes of combat. If you imagine a French soldier at the beginning of the 19th century, you must first imagine his boots, worn thin and patched with whatever leather could be found. The soles struck the earth mile after mile, hour after hour, from dawn until dusk. The pace was steady, the sound unremarkable, and yet it was this rhythm that defined his existence. Soldiers rose in the gray light of morning, often before the sun had shown itself, and prepared to walk again. They carried heavy packs that pressed against their shoulders, filled with bread that had already gone hard, salted meat that grew tougher with every passing day, and small personal belongings that reminded them of home. A tin cup, perhaps, or a piece of cloth from a wife or mother. They marched in lines that seemed endless, rows of men stretching along the horizon. At times, the land was flat, offering no distraction. At other times, the road twisted between forests or across hills, but the monotony remained. One step followed another, each almost indistinguishable from the last. The officers spoke rarely. Orders were given, but there was little conversation, only the creak of leather straps, the rattle of canteens, and the steady crunch of boots. The march was slow enough to feel dull, yet long enough to drain the spirit. Hours could pass without anything of note. A soldier might focus on the back of the man in front of him, noticing only the movement of shoulders and the sway of a musket. Hunger would gnaw gently, thirst would rise and fall, and still the line continued. Sometimes the air was filled with dust, stirred by thousands of feet. It coated the throat and made coughing inevitable. Other times it was rain, steady and soaking, that dampened uniforms until they clung to the skin. On cold days, breath rose like mist, forming small clouds that hovered briefly before dissolving into the air. On hot days, sweat soaked through linen and wool, and men walked with faces flushed and weary. Yet the march did not stop. There were always more miles to cover. Villages appeared rarely, often nothing more than a cluster of houses with shutters closed. Fields stretched on, bare or filled with crops, but the soldiers rarely paused to notice. Their task was simple: to move forward, to shorten the distance between themselves and wherever the emperor wished them to be. Sleep came each night with no ceremony. When the day's march ended, men dropped to the ground wherever they were allowed, often in open fields or beside roads. Fires were lit if wood could be found. If not, they huddled together against the cold. There was little talk of strategy or glory. Most spoke of food, of rest, of the small comforts denied to them. Bread and water were enough to quiet the body, but rarely enough to restore it fully. And in the morning, before they were ready, the order to rise came again, and the march began anew. This cycle repeated itself not for days, but for weeks and months. A soldier might look back on his service and realize that more of his time had been spent walking than fighting. He would remember landscapes more than battles, the endless view of roads that stretched ahead, the constant ache in his legs, the dull weight of his pack, and the sameness of each passing day. The march was not dramatic, yet it shaped him more than combat did. There was little honor in walking, but there was persistence. There was no audience to cheer, but there was the quiet endurance that bound one man to the next. In this way, Napoleon's armies were held together not only by loyalty or command, but by the shared experience of miles upon miles of weary, unremarkable marching. If you listen closely, you might still hear them in your imagination. The dull beat of leather soles on packed earth, a sound without excitement, without surprise, a sound that goes on until one cannot distinguish one step from another. It is a sound of history, not written in victories or defeats, but in the long, quiet journeys that filled the lives of ordinary men. As the march continued day after day, the soldiers grew used to the strange passage of time that long journeys bring. Hours felt heavy, yet weeks disappeared almost unnoticed. A man might wake in the morning certain that he could not take another step, but by nightfall he had covered 20 miles with the same weary determination as the day before. The body resisted at first, then yielded, until walking became not only a task, but a condition of existence. The road was always present, stretching ahead, waiting to be followed, indifferent to the men who trod upon it. Each soldier carried with him the quiet burdens of fatigue, hunger, and memory. Some thought often of families left behind, replaying conversations in their minds until the words blurred and lost their meaning. Others allowed their thoughts to wander nowhere in particular, letting the monotony of marching empty the mind of everything except the steady rhythm of footfalls. In this way, the march itself became a form of silence, a long meditation forced upon thousands of men. Sometimes the march brought them through open plains where nothing moved except the wind. At other times they climbed through mountain passes where air grew thin and the pace slowed, yet the line of men stretched unbroken. Rivers were crossed on crude bridges of wood or stone, each soldier waiting his turn, staring at the water flowing below with neither excitement nor fear. The soldiers did not pause to admire scenery, for beauty was a luxury not meant for tired eyes. They saw only the next mile, the next step, the next order to move on. The officers who led them also marched, though with slightly less weight to carry, and their words were rarely of comfort. Commands were short, practical, and final. The emperor himself was far ahead in thought, planning battles and strategies, while his men remained in the present reality of dirt roads and aching legs. Still, the thought of serving under Napoleon gave them a kind of quiet pride, even if that pride was buried beneath exhaustion. The supplies they carried grew lighter not by design, but because they were consumed. Bread turned to crumbs, meat grew scarce, and the water they carried was always in need of refilling from wells or streams along the way. Some days they ate only what could be found by chance, wild fruit, a rabbit caught in a snare, or nothing at all. Hunger was accepted as part of marching, a dull companion as constant as the weight of a musket. Illness, too, followed them. Coughs spread quickly, fevers rose and fell, and men weakened until they could no longer keep pace. When that happened, there was little ceremony. A soldier who could not march was left behind, entrusted to local villagers if fortune allowed, or simply abandoned to fate. The line could not stop for one man, not when thousands needed to reach the next point on the map. In this way, the march was relentless, unfeeling, a machine that moved forward regardless of the men who fell from its path. At night, when darkness settled over the camp, there was little joy. Fires flickered weakly, smoke curling into the air, and men ate in silence. Some wrote letters by the dim light of embers, their words careful and plain, reporting only that they were alive, though never certain the letter would reach its destination. Others sat quietly, staring into the flames until sleep claimed them. Dreams, if they came, were not grand visions of victory, but small fragments of home. Faces, voices, and meals long missed. In the stillness of night, the sounds of marching returned in memory, as if the feet continued to move even while the body rested. When dawn arrived, gray and cold, the cycle began again. Men rose stiff and sore, packed what little they had, and fell into line. There was no time for reluctance, no space for hesitation. The road waited, and they followed. The days blended together, each one echoing the last, until time itself seemed to vanish. In these marches, the soldiers became less like individuals and more like parts of a single body, moving with one will, shaped by one purpose, though none of them knew when the marching would truly end. They accepted the uncertainty with quiet endurance, for there was no other choice. And so the long road stretched on, carrying them forward step by step, into landscapes unknown, into a future unseen, into the endless rhythm of Napoleon's campaigns. The longer the soldiers marched, the more they came to understand that distance was not measured in miles, but in the small discomforts that accumulated with every step. A blister on the heel could stretch a mile into an eternity. A loose strap cutting into the shoulder could turn an hour into something endless. Yet still the army moved forward, for stopping was never truly an option. The officers kept count, the drummers beat their rhythm, and the men followed with a kind of silent acceptance. The march did not reward speed, nor did it forgive weakness. It simply continued, indifferent to each man's struggle. The landscape itself became part of the routine, observed not for its beauty, but for its resistance. A stretch of dry plain meant choking dust and thirst. A line of hills meant heavier breathing and slower pace. Forests brought shade, yet also mud that clung to boots and made each step heavier. Weather was less a matter of surprise than a constant companion. When rain fell, the soldiers kept moving. When snow came, they did the same, cloaks soaked through, uniforms stiffened, and yet the command was always forward. The seasons changed around them, but the rhythm of marching remained the same, steady and unrelenting. Along the way, they passed through towns and villages that often seemed wary of their presence. Some inhabitants watched silently from windows, others offered bread or water, but many shut their doors and turned away. To the local people, the soldiers were not heroes, but burdens, mouths to feed, strangers to fear, symbols of war that brought uncertainty and loss. The soldiers themselves rarely spoke to civilians, for orders forbade straying from the line, and exhaustion left little room for conversation. They saw only glimpses of ordinary life. A child carrying water from a well, a farmer tending fields, a woman hanging laundry in the wind. These brief sights reminded them of what they had left behind, but the line never paused long enough for reflection. Rest was short, and the sound of marching boots soon drowned out every memory. Supplies dwindled often, forcing men to rely on rations that grew smaller and more tasteless. Hard bread and thin soup became the standard meal, and though it filled the stomach, it offered little satisfaction. The soldiers ate without complaint, not because they were content, but because complaint changed nothing. Hunger was as much a part of their existence as the musket they carried. Water was gathered from streams or wells, often muddy or stale, yet it was consumed without hesitation. Illness spread easily in such conditions, and fevers struck many, but the march carried on regardless. For those who fell behind, there was rarely mercy. The line could not afford to wait, and so men who stumbled often vanished from sight, swallowed by the land and the silence. In this way, the march was both unifying and cruel. It bound the healthy together while discarding the weak, shaping the army into a force that endured not by choice, but by necessity. At night, when the day's labor ended, soldiers collapsed wherever they could. The ground became their bed, and the sky their roof. Some nights were quiet, broken only by the soft sounds of men shifting in sleep. Other nights were restless, filled with coughing, groans, and the snapping of damp wood and weak fires. There were no grand speeches, no stirring songs, only the slow unwinding of bodies pushed beyond comfort. Letters from home, when they arrived, were read carefully and kept close, treasured more than any coin. Yet such moments were rare, for the march moved faster than the post could follow. Many soldiers never heard from their families again until years had passed, if at all. The army lived not in connection, but in isolation, bound together by hardship rather than joy. And so, day after day, the soldiers awoke with stiff joints and heavy eyes, lifted their packs, and placed one foot before the other. The road was endless, the destination uncertain, but still they marched, not because they believed the journey itself mattered, but because they had no other path. To stop was to fall behind, and to fall behind was to disappear. In this way, Napoleon's soldiers became creatures of the march, defined less by battle than by the weary persistence of motion. Their legacy was not only in victories won or empires built, but in the forgotten miles of mud and stone, the countless steps that echoed into history, as little more than a dull, steady beat across the land. The march was not always across open land or through small villages. Often it wound along narrow roads where wagons creaked under the weight of supplies and artillery pieces groaned as horses pulled them forward. The sound was steady but never pleasant, a mixture of iron rims striking stone and the constant clatter of wood under strain. Men grew accustomed to it, just as they grew accustomed to the ache in their legs and the weight of their muskets. Even noise became part of the monotony, a background rhythm that followed them like a shadow. There were no moments of silence, only changes in sound, boots on gravel, wheels on mud, the low murmur of voices too tired to rise above a whisper. Occasionally, songs were attempted, but fatigue soon drowned them, leaving only fragments of melody scattered along the line. As days stretched into weeks, the soldiers began to lose their sense of individual time. They no longer counted days as separate, but rather as pieces of a single, unending journey. A man might try to remember when he had last seen a particular village, or crossed a certain river, but the details blurred together until memory itself was dulled. What remained was the repetition. Waking, walking, resting, and then waking again. Each sunrise looked the same, each sunset brought the same weary relief, and each nightfall carried the certainty that morning would demand the same steps once more. The officers did not explain the purpose of each march, nor did the men ask. The destination was rarely told, for it did not matter. To the soldier, what mattered was surviving the present day, reaching the next camp, and finding enough strength to begin again. The emperor's grand strategies were distant, spoken of in hushed tones, but never felt on the ground. For the men, there was only the march. Food remained scarce, and the quality worsened with each passing week. Bread became stale, meat spoiled in the heat, and water grew foul when barrels could not be refilled. Yet hunger and thirst were not unusual, merely companions that walked beside every soldier. They learned to endure with quiet patience, chewing slowly to make rations last longer, drinking sparingly to stretch what little they had. Some men carried with them charms or small tokens of home, convinced that these objects gave them strength, though the true strength came only from habit, from the endless training of body and will through miles upon miles of walking. When weather turned cruel, the hardships deepened. Storms broke across their path, drenching the line until uniforms clung heavy and cold. Winds howled through valleys, turning breath into white mist, and snow pressed down on the road until feet sank with each step. Yet the order was always the same: forward. Cloaks froze stiff in the night, boots cracked under the strain, and still the march went on. No man could refuse it. No man could step aside without consequence. It was not courage that carried them, but necessity, the knowledge that there was no choice but to continue. Illness and injury took their toll. Feet blistered and bled, joints swelled, and coughs deepened into fevers. Those who fell behind were often gone by the next morning, whether to sickness, capture, or the land itself. The march was not a place for weakness, and mercy was a luxury no army could afford. The men who survived did so by will alone, and even that will was often stretched thin. At night, the camp was not a place of rest, but of mere pause. Fires flickered, food was rationed, and sleep came in uneasy fragments. Dreams were short, often broken by the sound of orders, the shuffle of movement, or the restless murmurs of men who could not fully sleep. Letters from home remained rare treasures, read over and over until the paper grew thin. They reminded the soldiers of lives far away, yet also deepened the ache of distance. And in the quiet after reading, the march waited again, patient and unyielding. The road stretched out before them always, never satisfied, never complete. It demanded step after step, mile after mile, until men began to believe that marching was not something they did, but something they had become. They were no longer individuals, but parts of a moving line, a living chain that wound through Europe in service of the emperor's ambitions. And so, as the stars faded and the sky lightened once more, they rose again, lifted their packs, adjusted their muskets, and followed the sound of boots ahead of them. Forward was the only direction, and the march was endless. As the columns pressed farther into distant lands, the routine of marching became so deeply ingrained that soldiers began to lose track of where they were. Maps were rarely shown to common men, and the names of villages or rivers often meant little, for they passed too quickly to matter. The world was reduced to the feel of the ground underfoot and the weight of the sky above, to the sound of boots striking in rhythm, and the faint call of orders carried by officers. The march stretched beyond geography and became its own landscape, a place defined not by landmarks, but by the endless repetition of motion. Days blended into one another until men could not remember when one campaign ended and another began. The mind adjusted in strange ways. Some soldiers found themselves counting steps without realizing, whispering numbers that grew until they lost track and began again. Others hummed fragments of forgotten songs to fill the silence. Many fell into long stretches of thought where memory, imagination, and fatigue tangled together. leaving them uncertain whether they were remembering home or dreaming while still awake. The body moved even when the mind drifted, for the line itself carried every man forward, a current too strong to resist. The seasons turned slowly, and each brought its own burdens. In summer, heat shimmered over the road, and men staggered beneath the weight of sun and dust. Their throats burned, their skin blistered, and their uniforms clung with sweat. In autumn, rain swept across fields and roads, turning paths to rivers of mud that sucked at boots and slowed every wagon. In winter, snow hardened the land, cold gnawed at fingers, and breath froze against scarves and collars. Even spring, with its promise of renewal, brought flooding rivers and storms that drenched men before the warmth had fully arrived. There was no season that offered relief, only different challenges that shaped the march in endless variety of hardship. Along the way, the soldiers encountered the traces of others who had passed before them. Abandoned camps littered with broken wagons, discarded shoes, and scattered bones reminded them that armies were always followed by silence. Grave markers appeared at the edge of roads, some marked with names, many not. A soldier might glance at them briefly, but soon his eyes returned to the path ahead, for he knew that lingering too long on such sights could weaken his resolve. Death was not rare, but part of the rhythm, woven into the march as naturally as the sunrise. Rations continued to shrink as the army moved deeper from its supply lines. Men grew thin, cheeks hollow, eyes sunken. Bread was shared in small pieces, meat stretched until flavor vanished, and sometimes hunger forced them to boil weeds or scrape whatever could be found along the way. The stomach complained, but the legs carried on, as if the body had learned to move independent of nourishment. The promise of eventual rest or battle, though distant, was enough to keep the line moving. And always there was the shadow of Napoleon himself, distant but constant. The men rarely saw him, yet his presence was felt in every command, every mile covered, every hardship endured. They marched for the emperor, though most had never spoken a word to him. His ambitions carried them across Europe, and his strategies turned their feet into instruments of conquest. They did not question, for questioning did not shorten the road. Instead, they accepted their role as pieces in a vast design they could not fully see. At night, fatigue settled over the camp like a heavy blanket. Men collapsed onto the earth, using packs as pillows, cloaks as covers. Fires flickered weakly against the darkness, casting shadows across weary faces. Conversation was scarce, laughter almost absent. What little was spoken often concerned the simplest things: food, warmth, family far away. Letters, when they arrived, were read quietly, then folded and stored as treasures more valuable than coins or medals. Sleep came quickly, though never deeply. The sound of marching often lingered in their dreams, a dull echo that followed them even into rest. And when morning returned, gray and familiar, they rose once again, strapped on their packs, adjusted their muskets, and stepped forward into another day. The march had no end in sight, and so they accepted that it might last forever. To march was to exist, to keep moving was to survive. And in the quiet persistence of countless footsteps, the story of Napoleon's soldiers was written, not in glory, but in the endless rhythm of weary men moving ever onward. There were moments on the march when the line of soldiers seemed less like an army and more like a river, flowing endlessly forward, bending with the land, swelling and thinning, but never stopping. Each man was a drop of water carried along by the current of orders, discipline, and necessity. A soldier did not choose where to step. He simply followed the one before him, and in this way, the miles passed without decision. The sameness of it all dulled the mind, until days felt like long stretches of identical motion. Boots struck the ground, straps creaked, breath rose and fell, and nothing else mattered. The rhythm was hypnotic, and many found themselves slipping into a kind of waking trance, where thoughts wandered far from the road, and yet the body continued on without pause. At times, the march wound through vast plains where the horizon stretched endlessly, and the soldiers felt as though they were crossing not land but time itself, caught in a journey that had no clear destination. At other times, the path led through forests where branches creaked overhead and shadows pooled between the trees, making the line seem swallowed by a world of quiet green. Yet even these changes offered little relief from monotony, for the duty remained unchanged. Forward, always forward. Villages along the way became fewer, and when they appeared, they bore the signs of fatigue as well. Doors closed quickly when the soldiers arrived, wells ran dry under the strain of filling so many canteens, and the people themselves seemed wary and withdrawn. A soldier might glimpse a mother gathering children inside, or an old man watching silently from a doorway, but there was rarely exchange beyond the necessities. The march left little behind but trampled roads and broken earth, scars upon the land that matched the wear on the men. Supplies grew scarcer as the army moved deeper, forcing men to stretch their rations thinner still. Bread crumbled into dust, meat became rare enough to be shared among several, and water was often muddy or stale. Yet the men ate and drank what they were given without resistance, for to complain was useless, and to stop eating was to weaken further. Hunger became a quiet companion, its ache always present, its complaints always ignored. The soldiers accepted it as they accepted the weight of their muskets, the stiffness of their packs, and the endlessness of the road. Illness walked among them as steadily as any man. Coughs turned into fevers, small wounds became infected, and fatigue slipped into weakness. Men who could no longer march were left behind, their fates uncertain, for the line could not halt. There were no ceremonies, no farewells, only the slow realization that another face was missing from the group. And yet the march continued, indifferent to the absence. This quiet cruelty was understood by all, for survival depended on the strength of the line, not the comfort of the individual. Nights brought little rest. The ground was always cold, the fires always small, and the air filled with the low murmur of men trying to find comfort in hard conditions. Some slept quickly, collapsing in exhaustion. Others lay awake, staring at the stars or the dim glow of embers, thinking of home, or perhaps thinking of nothing at all. Dreams were filled with marching still, as if the rhythm of footsteps had settled permanently into the mind. Even in rest, the soldiers were not free of the road. And so dawn came again, gray and familiar, and the men rose to repeat the cycle. They pulled on boots stiff with mud, lifted packs that seemed heavier each morning, and stepped once more into the line. The march was not measured in victories, nor in destinations reached, but in the persistence of men who placed one foot before the other because there was no other choice. Napoleon's armies were remembered for great battles, but those battles were built upon the backs of countless weary marches. Without the endless days of walking, there would have been no triumphs, no conquests, no empire. It was the quiet endurance of ordinary men that carried the emperor's ambitions across Europe. And so the march remained, steady and unending, a dull echo of footsteps stretching across time, reminding us that history is not only written in moments of glory, but in the forgotten miles covered by soldiers who never stopped moving forward. The march seemed eternal, as if the soldiers were caught in a cycle that belonged to no particular place or time, only to the endless forward movement of weary men. Each step pressed into the ground became part of an invisible path that stretched behind them like a shadow, a trail of dust and memory left for no one to see. The soldiers themselves rarely looked back, for there was nothing behind them but the miles already endured. Ahead was the same road, the same horizon, the same promise of tomorrow's march. Days passed with such sameness that men began to lose the measure of time. A week felt no different from a month, and a month no different from a season. What they remembered most were not dates or places, but sensations. The bite of frost in the morning, the ache of shoulders beneath heavy packs, the taste of stale bread softened in water. These small details became the true markers of their lives, while larger events blurred into indistinct memory. Even battles, when they came, seemed like interruptions in the greater story of marching. The fighting might last a few hours, perhaps a day, but soon enough the survivors were walking again, following the same rhythm that had carried them before. To a soldier, the march was the real campaign, and the battle only a brief pause in the longer journey. Nature offered little relief. Fields stretched without end, forests closed in with shadows, rivers crossed their path and were forded without ceremony. The beauty of the land, if beauty was there, went unnoticed by tired eyes. To see a sunset was not to admire its colors, but to recognize that the day had ended and rest, however brief, was near. To hear birds was not to enjoy their song, but to know that morning had begun. And another day of marching lay ahead. The world itself became background, stripped of meaning by repetition. Supplies, as always, remained scarce, and the men adapted with the same dull persistence, Hard biscuits were broken into smaller pieces to make them last, meat boiled until flavor disappeared, and water drawn from streams without care for its clarity. Hunger gnawed but never destroyed, for the body learned to endure what the stomach could not accept. The soldiers spoke little of food, for to do so only deepened the ache. Instead, they walked in silence, chewing when commanded to stop, swallowing quickly and resuming their place in the line. Illness and exhaustion continued to claim men, and their absence was acknowledged with quiet resignation. A soldier might glance at an empty space beside him, realize the man had fallen behind, and then fix his eyes once more on the back of the man in front. There was no mourning, only acceptance. The march did not pause, and so the men did not pause either. They learned to harden their hearts, not through cruelty, but through necessity. At night, the camps offered little comfort. Fires were small, warmth was fleeting, and the ground was always hard. Yet even these meager conditions became familiar, and familiarity itself brought a kind of reassurance. A soldier could look at the dim glow of embers and know that others sat beside him, sharing the same fatigue, the same hunger, the same restless dreams. In that shared struggle, there was unity, though it was rarely spoken. Words were unnecessary, when every man already knew the same hardships. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and filled with echoes of the march. Footsteps sounded even in dreams, steady and endless, as if the road itself had entered their minds. Men awoke with the sensation of still walking, only to rise and resume the real journey once more. And so, morning after morning, the cycle repeated. Boots pressed into the dirt, packs weighed on shoulders, and the line stretched out across the land. Napoleon's soldiers, remembered for their battles, were in truth shaped more by these forgotten miles, by the endless persistence of movement, by the dull endurance that carried them farther than glory ever could. Their story was not of sudden triumphs, but of quiet survival, of men who became part of the march itself, bound forever to the road that demanded everything and gave nothing in return. As the march dragged further into unfamiliar territories, the soldiers began to feel as though they were moving not only across land, but across the very fabric of their own endurance. Each mile seemed to test the body in new ways, stretching muscles, wearing down joints, and carving fatigue deep into their bones. Yet still the march continued, indifferent to the suffering of the men, as if the road itself demanded obedience. Every morning brought the same routine, the sharp call to rise, the slow tightening of straps, the lifting of heavy packs, the first reluctant steps that grew into the steady rhythm of another long day. It was repetition without change, and in that repetition the soldiers lost themselves, becoming almost mechanical in their movements, as though their bodies marched without conscious thought. The road was marked not by milestones or signs, but by the memories of hardship endured along its length. A field where men had collapsed from heat, a river where they had drunk muddy water, a village where doors were closed tightly against them. These were the landmarks etched into their minds. They rarely spoke of them, yet each man carried the images quietly, as reminders of the distance already traveled. And still the line stretched forward, unbroken, silent except for the dull cadence of boots striking earth. The weather remained a constant adversary, sometimes lashing them with rain that soaked through every layer of clothing, sometimes scorching them with sun that burned the skin and blurred the horizon. At night, frost would creep across their cloaks, leaving men to wake shivering, their breath hanging in the cold air. Yet none of this altered the command. Whether rain or sun, frost or heat, the order was always forward. The soldiers learned not to hope for better conditions, but simply to endure whatever the day offered. Endurance became their only virtue, the quiet strength that allowed them to take one more step when they believed they could not. Food continued to dwindle, and hunger became as familiar as the musket slung across each man's back. Hard bread was eaten slowly to trick the stomach, scraps of meat were boiled into thin soup, and sometimes even grass or weeds were gathered when nothing else remained. The meals were tasteless, yet the act of eating provided comfort, a reminder that survival was still possible. The men did not complain loudly, for complaint did not fill an empty stomach, and so they ate in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts as the embers of small fires flickered weakly in the night. Illness stalked them in quiet persistence. Fevers drained strength, coughs shook weary bodies, wounds festered in the damp, and men fell away one by one. Their absence was noted only briefly before the march consumed the space they left behind. The line never halted, for the living could not wait for the dying. To survive was to keep moving, and so they did, pressing forward even as comrades vanished into silence. At night, when the road at last released them, the soldiers lay on hard ground and stared at the stars, though few truly saw them. Most were too weary to notice anything beyond the weight of fatigue pressing down upon them. Some dreamed of home, though the faces they imagined were fading with time, becoming blurred and uncertain. Others dreamed of marching still, their feet moving even in sleep, carrying them down endless roads with no destination. When dawn came, they rose again, as if pulled by invisible strings, and repeated the cycle. It was not courage that carried them, nor even loyalty, but habit. Habit forged through miles of suffering, habit that dulled fear, hunger, and pain into something ordinary. They no longer questioned why they marched or where they were going. The march itself was the answer, the single fact that governed their lives. They were soldiers, and soldiers marched. And so the story of Napoleon's armies was written less in the brilliance of battle than in these quiet, weary steps, repeated endlessly, fading into the forgotten corners of history, where the sound of boots on earth echoes without end. The longer the march went on, the more it seemed to erase individuality, turning thousands of men into a single moving shape, a human machine that advanced not by will, but by momentum. Each soldier still carried his own memories, his own aches, and his own fears. Yet these private burdens dissolved into the rhythm of the march until one man was indistinguishable from the next. The road had no concern for personal thoughts. It demanded only steps, and the soldiers gave them endlessly, day after day. In the beginning, some men tried to keep track of distance, counting the miles covered or marking days upon scraps of paper, but soon even this effort faded. The numbers became meaningless, swallowed by repetition, and eventually the only measure of time was the sun above and the order to rise in the morning. Seasons shifted slowly, and the soldiers felt them less as change than as variations of discomfort. Heat pressed down in summer, cold crept in winter, and rain soaked everything in between. A man could not remember how many storms he had endured, or how many times frost had covered his cloak at dawn. Such details blurred into one endless hardship, accepted not because it was easy, but because it was unavoidable. The march had no room for refusal. Hunger remained constant, shaping the body into leaner forms, hollowing cheeks, and sharpening bones. Rations that once seemed small became precious, and the act of eating, though brief and unsatisfying, became the highlight of each day. Bread so hard it cracked teeth was softened in water, thin soup was savored as though it were a feast, and sometimes nothing at all was offered but hope for tomorrow. Yet the men still walked, fueled by little more than habit and the need to remain within the safety of the line. Illness did not slow its pace. Men coughed until their chests ached, limped until their legs gave out, and collapsed into the dust. Those who fell were noticed only for a moment before the road swallowed them. Comrades offered brief glances, perhaps a whispered thought, but no one stopped. The march was merciless, and to survive meant to accept its cruelty. Mercy was a burden the army could not carry. At night, the camps offered the illusion of rest, but rarely the reality. Fires smoked more than they burned, and the ground was unforgiving. Men slept in their clothes, boots still on, cloaks pulled tightly around them, muskets kept close at hand. The sounds of sleep were not peaceful, but restless. Groans, coughs, the crackle of damp wood, the shifting of bodies unable to find comfort. Dreams, when they came, were often of the road itself, the steady beat of footsteps continuing into the dark. Some awoke unsure whether they had truly rested or only continued marching in another form. Letters from home, when they reached the soldiers, were read and reread until the paper grew fragile. The words of wives, mothers, or children were held close to the heart, offering a brief warmth that hunger and fatigue could not erase. Yet even these precious moments were fleeting, for the march allowed no indulgence in memory. The next dawn would come, and with it the same command: forward. In this endless cycle, the soldiers came to understand that glory was not found in the grand battles spoken of by officers or promised by the emperor. Glory for them was simply survival, the ability to rise each morning and place one foot in front of the other despite every reason to stop. Their story was not one of triumph, but of endurance, not of conquest, but of persistence. And as they moved farther into unknown lands, the line of soldiers became less a symbol of power than a testament to human stubbornness, the refusal to surrender to fatigue, hunger, or despair. Step after step, mile after mile, their lives became the march itself, and history recorded their journey not in the details of each man, but in the collective sound of countless boots pressing forward into the silence of an unending road. The march, in the end, became less a journey from one place to another and more a condition of life itself. For the soldiers, it was not a matter of beginning and ending, but of existing within the rhythm of footsteps and the quiet demand of distance. Each sunrise meant the same ritual, each sunset the same collapse, and in between stretched the long hours of steady movement that consumed their strength and defined their days. The road no longer felt like a path laid upon the earth, but like a force of nature, eternal and indifferent, carrying them forward with no regard for their exhaustion. Men who once spoke of glory, of returning home with stories to tell, found themselves instead speaking less and less until silence replaced conversation. Words were unnecessary. When all thoughts turned toward endurance, what mattered was not the future or the past, but the single act of placing one foot before the other. Even pain grew quiet, absorbed into habit, dulled by repetition until it became background noise. A blister, a hunger pang, a stiff joint. These were no longer obstacles but familiar companions, reminders that the body still lived and moved. Hunger itself became an unending shadow, shaping every thought without fully consuming it. The rations were meager, the bread hard and stale, the water often foul, and yet each mouthful was accepted with gratitude, for it meant one more day of survival. Men ate quickly and silently, then resumed their march, never expecting satisfaction, only continuation. Illness continued to thin their numbers. Coughs echoed in the ranks, fevers burned in the night, and wounds refused to heal in the damp. When a man fell, he was left behind, and though comrades felt the loss, they did not stop, for the march did not stop. The line filled the gap and pressed forward, the absence swallowed by necessity. In this way, the march revealed its cruelest truth, that it cared nothing for the individual, only for the movement of the whole. Nights remained uneasy, the ground hard, the fires weak, and sleep broken. Dreams mirrored the day, filled with roads that never ended, with the sound of boots that echoed endlessly. Even in rest, the march persisted, seeping into the mind until there was no difference between waking and sleeping. The soldiers dreamed of home less often as time went on, for the faces they loved seemed farther away with every mile, blurred by distance and fatigue. What remained was the simple knowledge that morning would come, and with it, the march. Yet within this monotony lay a strange kind of unity. Each soldier, though silent and weary, was bound to the man beside him by the shared rhythm of steps. They were individuals no longer, but parts of a single body that moved as one, enduring together, suffering together, and surviving together. That bond, though unspoken, gave the march its strength. It was not courage that carried them, nor hope, nor even loyalty, but the quiet presence of one another, the knowledge that no man walked alone in his suffering. And so the long marches of Napoleon's soldiers became their true legacy, more than any battle or victory. History would remember the emperor, the strategies, the wars, and the conquests, but behind those stories lay the forgotten miles walked by ordinary men. Their footsteps carved paths across Europe, not in triumph, but in persistence, not in glory, but in endurance. It was the steady, weary sound of countless boots upon the earth that built the empire, and it was that same sound that echoed when the empire began to fade. For long after the victories were celebrated and the defeats recorded, the memory of those marches lingered, a reminder that the weight of history rests not only on great leaders, but on the silent endurance of those who carried their ambitions forward, one step at a time, into the endless horizon. That is the end of the previous story. Before we move on, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue bringing you these quiet journeys through history. And now let us drift gently into the next story in our series of Boring History for Sleep, the construction of medieval fortifications. When we think of the Middle Ages, It is often the castles and fortifications that first come to mind, standing like silent witnesses to a world long past. Yet these stone giants were not born overnight. Their construction was a slow, deliberate, and often monotonous process, carried out over years, sometimes even decades, by countless workers whose names were never recorded. To imagine the making of a medieval fortification, one must begin with the choice of location. A hilltop, a bend in a river, or a rocky outcrop was selected not for beauty, but for practicality. The higher the ground, the greater the advantage, the wider the view of land and enemy alike. Once chosen, the work began, not with grand walls, but with clearing. Trees were felled, earth leveled, and stones gathered. Men labored from dawn to dusk, lifting, carrying, and cutting with tools that were simple and heavy. The sound was constant. The strike of iron on rock, the scrape of shovels, the groan of carts pulled by oxen. Day after day, the land slowly shifted under human hands. Foundations were laid deep into the earth, for the strength of the walls depended on what could not be seen. Trenches were dug, filled with stone and mortar, and packed tightly so that the weight of future towers might rest upon them. This stage alone could last months, for mistakes made below the ground would not reveal themselves until it was too late. Above the foundations, the first walls began to rise. Stone by stone, layer upon layer, they grew. Each stone had to be cut and shaped, carried into place, and set carefully with lime mortar. The masons worked slowly, measuring and aligning, for one crooked angle might weaken an entire section. Behind them, laborers lifted more stone, mixed more mortar, and hauled more materials. The rhythm of their work unchanging, the effort unending. Scaffolding of wood surrounded the rising walls, ladders creaked under weight, and ropes strained as blocks were hoisted higher. From a distance, progress seemed slow, almost invisible. A wall might rise only a few feet in a season, and the fortress looked less like a castle and more like a jagged pile of stone. Yet slowly, patiently, the shape took form. Towers began to appear, round or square, meant to watch the land and protect the gates. Each tower was a project in itself, rising with narrow stairs winding upward, with arrow slits cut into the walls for defenders unseen. Wooden beams supported floors inside, though many of these would later rot and need replacing, for wood could not endure like stone. Gatehouses demanded even greater care. The entry to a fortress was its weakness, and so it became the most carefully built. Heavy timbers were fitted to make doors, iron bands forged to strengthen them, and above the gate a slot was left for the portcullis, a heavy grille of wood and iron that could be dropped in moments of danger. To build such a structure took time, and time was measured not in weeks or months, but in years. Whole generations of laborers could pass before a castle stood complete. Children who watched their fathers carry stones might one day carry stones themselves before seeing the work finished. The pace was slow because there was no choice. The tools were simple, the methods old, and the materials stubborn. Yet the work continued without pause, for defense was not a luxury, but a necessity. As the walls rose, ditches were dug outside, sometimes filled with water, sometimes left dry, their steep sides making approach difficult. Earth was moved by hand, cart after cart, shovel after shovel, until the ground itself had been reshaped into lines of defense. Palisades of sharpened timber were sometimes placed as temporary barriers until the stone was ready. Reminders that war did not wait for construction to finish. Within the walls, buildings began to appear. Storehouses for grain, wells dug deep for water, barracks for soldiers, chapels for prayer. Each served its purpose, each demanded labor, and each added to the slow transformation of bare earth into fortress. And so the years passed in steady rhythm, the sound of tools striking, carts rolling, and voices calling across scaffolding. There was no drama in the daily work, no sudden triumph, only the quiet persistence of men who lifted stone after stone, guided by plans that stretched beyond their own lifetimes. The fortress, when complete, would stand as a symbol of power and protection. But during its making, it was simply a place of labor, a project measured in inches and in years, a testament not to the glory of kings, but to the endurance of those who built silently, day after day. As the construction of a medieval fortification advanced beyond its earliest foundations, The process entered a stage of constant repetition, a rhythm of labor that defined the lives of masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, and laborers alike. The rising walls became a landscape of scaffolds and ladders, where men climbed daily carrying stone, mortar, and timber, repeating movements until muscle remembered them without thought. Stonecutters worked in nearby quarries, chipping endlessly at blocks of limestone or granite, shaping them to fit with precision into the rising walls. Their hammers struck in steady beats, ringing out across the fields, the sound as familiar as the tolling of church bells. Each block had to be measured, lifted, and set into place, and the masons took pride in fitting stone to stone with barely a gap. Though the work consumed time without mercy, blacksmiths, too, labored without pause, for every hinge, nail, chain, and band of iron required careful forging. Their forges glowed with heat, sparks flying as hammer met anvil, the repetition unending. Iron strengthened gates, held timbers together, and bound doors so that they could withstand assault. Carpenters shaped beams for floors, rafters for roofs, and frames for scaffolds, their saws rasping in steady rhythm, the smell of cut wood mixing with the dust of stone. All these trades together formed the slow heartbeat of construction, a cycle that lasted from dawn until dusk, season after season. Weather became an ever-present challenge. Rain softened mortar and delayed work, snow froze the ground and stiffened fingers, and wind tore at scaffolds, making every climb dangerous. Yet labor did not stop, for fortifications were not luxuries, but necessities, in an age when raids and wars threatened constantly. Work slowed, perhaps, but it never ceased entirely. Men adapted, working under shelters when storms came, thawing stiff mortar near fires in winter, and shading themselves with rough cloth in the heat of summer. Seasons changed, yet the rhythm remained. The fortress grew inch by inch, its towers higher, its walls thicker, its gates heavier. To those who worked upon it, progress often seemed invisible, hidden in the sheer scale of the task. But slowly, a shape emerged that altered the landscape itself. A hilltop once bare became crowned with stone. A river bend once open became guarded by towers. A valley once empty became dominated by walls. Generation by generation, the transformation was undeniable. The lives of workers were consumed by the task. Laborers earned little coin, paid daily or weekly, often enough only to feed their families. Masons, more skilled, commanded slightly higher wages, but still lived modestly, their craft valued yet never celebrated. Children sometimes joined in simple tasks, carrying water for mixing mortar or gathering wood for fires. Women, too, found roles in providing food, hauling supplies, or aiding in small labors. The entire community often became tied to the construction, for the fortress was not merely a project for lords, but a place that promised security for all when completed. Inside the growing walls, spaces began to take shape. The courtyard widened, wells were dug deeper, and storage pits prepared for grain. The chapel rose slowly, a small tower of faith within the larger fortress of stone, and its bells would one day call both soldiers and masons to prayer. Barracks lined one side, built of timber at first, but in time rebuilt with stone, for permanence was always the goal. The rhythm of building did not differ much from the rhythm of marching in an army. It was repetitive, weary, and often without excitement. Yet it shaped the men who carried it out, binding them to the land and to one another through shared labor. There was little glory in carrying stones, mixing mortar, or forging nails. Yet without these quiet acts repeated endlessly, the mighty fortresses of Europe could never have risen. In the end, what appeared as strength and permanence was born not from grandeur, but from monotony, from the patience of countless hands repeating simple tasks across decades. To walk among medieval fortifications today is to see not only towers and battlements, but the silent memory of years upon years of toil, a slow story of persistence written in stone. The construction of a medieval fortification was not a sudden endeavor, but an endless cycle of repetition that could stretch across decades. And each stage of progress introduced new layers of labor that tested the endurance of entire communities. Once the outer walls began to rise to a height that demanded constant maintenance of scaffolding, the work became a balance between careful craftsmanship and sheer physical strain. Wooden scaffolds had to be rebuilt as the walls climbed, and ropes and pulleys were used again and again to lift blocks of stone that weighed more than a man could carry. Teams of laborers, often peasants hired for the season, walked in circles around large treadwheels to pull weights upward. The rhythm slow and unchanging, their bodies swaying with the steady grind of wood against wood. Each stone, when placed, represented not a triumph, but another link in a chain of endless effort. Inside the fortress, space was slowly being divided. Foundations for halls, kitchens, stables, and chapels were traced out upon the ground with chalk or rope. Carpenters laid beams, masons shaped arches, and the work advanced like a puzzle built piece by piece without pause. The main towers, meant to dominate the skyline, rose more slowly than the walls, for each required a spiral staircase cut carefully into the stone, arrow slits placed at calculated angles, and chambers aligned with precision. These towers took years to complete, and their progress could seem invisible to those who labored daily at their base. To a worker, it was the same rhythm: hammers striking stone, mortar mixed in troughs, and scaffolds creaking under the weight of men and tools. Yet little by little, the towers rose, their shadows lengthening across the land, a visible sign to distant travelers that authority and defense were being carved from the earth itself. Outside the walls, the landscape changed as well. Ditches deepened, earthworks grew higher, and temporary wooden defenses gave way to more permanent stone structures. Workers dug with spades and carried earth away in carts, repeating the same motion thousands of times until the land was reshaped into steep slopes that would make attack difficult. The moat, if planned, took years to complete, for it demanded both excavation and redirection of nearby water. All of this happened slowly, season after season, with little variation except the weather, which dictated whether the ground was frozen, muddy, or dry. The workers endured it as they endured the monotony of their tasks, for to build a fortress was not an act of inspiration, but of persistence. Life around the construction adapted to its rhythm. Markets grew near the site, supplying food and goods to the laborers. Inns and taverns appeared to serve travelers, traders, and craftsmen. Slowly, a community expanded around the growing walls, for people knew that where a fortress stood, safety and commerce would eventually follow. Yet for the builders themselves, the work was wearying and repetitive. Days blended into weeks, weeks into years, and progress was measured not by dramatic achievements but by inches of wall and layers of stone. Accidents were common. A rope might snap, a scaffold collapse, or a stone fall from height, and men would be injured or killed. Yet the work never ceased for long, for the demand for defense outweighed the loss of life. New workers replaced the fallen, and the cycle continued. To those who labored, it was not glory they sought, but survival, wages to feed families, and the knowledge that their work would outlast them. And so the fortifications grew, their strength born not from sudden genius, but from the slow, quiet persistence of countless anonymous hands. To see a medieval fortress today is to see not just stone, but years of endurance, repetition, and patience carved into every wall and tower, a monument less to kings and lords than to the ordinary people who spent their lives lifting stones into place. As the years of construction stretched on, the fortress slowly transformed from scattered foundations and half-built walls into a structure that began to resemble permanence. Yet the process remained repetitive, methodical, and unending. The masons continued their patient work, chiseling each stone to fit its place, spreading lime mortar with practiced movements, and tapping the blocks into alignment with wooden mallets. Carpenters hammered beams for scaffolding, then dismantled them only to raise them higher again as walls grew taller. Blacksmiths supplied nails, hinges, and tools in a steady stream, their forges glowing day and night, filling the air with the ring of hammer upon anvil. Laborers carried stones and buckets of mortar in endless circuits, up ladders, across planks, back again, repeating the same steps so often that the body remembered them without thought. Each day's progress was measured in small increments, often invisible to casual eyes, but inch by inch, season by season, the fortress advanced. The outer curtain walls rose first, thick and heavy, their purpose clear, to absorb attack and resist siege engines. Behind them, towers swelled upward, square or round, their spiral staircases carved in slow curves, their arrow slits narrow and carefully angled to provide defense without weakness. Gatehouses, always the most complex structures, demanded extra time. Builders measured and remeasured, fitted grooves for portcullises, built murder holes above the entry, and reinforced doors with heavy iron bands. This work was delicate compared to the hauling of stone, yet still repetitive, requiring endless small adjustments until the pieces aligned. Inside the walls, the fortress took shape as a living space. Kitchens were built with wide hearths, their chimneys slowly rising alongside the towers. Storerooms were walled in, their floors lined with stone to keep out dampness. Chapels were constructed with care, small but central, for even in a fortress, faith was considered a necessary foundation. Barracks stretched along the inner wall, first of timber, later of stone, where soldiers would sleep in rows upon straw. Stables were added for horses, smithies for weapons, and wells dug deep to provide water during sieges. Every corner of the space served a purpose, and each required patient labor that extended through years. Outside the fortress, the defensive works expanded as well. Ditches grew wider, slopes sharper, earthworks taller. If a moat was planned, channels were dug to bring water, and the muddy labor of shoveling earth seemed endless. The road leading to the gate was designed deliberately to expose attackers, curving to slow approach, lined with obstacles to prevent speed. All of this required not brilliance but persistence. Thousands of hours of steady labor by men who rarely saw the full plan but contributed their share regardless. The construction site itself became a small world. Markets formed nearby to feed the workers, and villages grew as families settled close to steady employment. Children ran between wagons, carrying water or tools, while women sold food, cloth, and other necessities. Life intertwined with labor, and the building of the fortress became the center of community rhythm. Festivals and church days marked time, but otherwise, each day resembled the last, filled with the sound of stone, wood, and iron. Accidents remained common, and when scaffolds collapsed or stones fell, lives were lost. Yet the work continued almost without pause, for the demand for protection outweighed every other concern. The names of those who died were soon forgotten, their effort absorbed into the fortress itself, which rose steadily, indifferent to the cost. To those who labored, the work was rarely about glory or recognition. It was about survival, wages, and duty, but also the strange comfort of routine. Each strike of hammer, each lift of stone, each shovel of earth carried the fortress closer to completion, though few workers would live to see the final result. In this way, medieval fortifications became monuments not only to the power of lords and kings, but to the patience of countless anonymous hands. Their story was not dramatic, but slow and steady, written in stone laid upon stone, an enduring rhythm that echoed through the centuries. As the fortress grew more defined, its walls reaching higher and its towers casting longer shadows, the daily labor remained unchanged in its rhythm, for the making of a medieval fortification was less a story of sudden progress and more a tale of unending repetition. The same tools struck in the same way, the same stones were lifted and placed, the same ropes pulled and the same scaffolds creaked under weight. From a distance, the site might have looked busy, filled with workers climbing ladders, hauling carts, or mixing mortar, but for the men within it, the sensation was one of monotony, each day echoing the last. Yet it was through this monotony that strength was born, for every inch of wall demanded patience and persistence. The outer curtain continued to rise, stone upon stone, its thickness requiring endless cartloads of rock, cut from quarries miles away. The oxen that hauled these loads trudged along familiar paths, their hooves carving ruts into the earth, and the wagons themselves groaned with weight, repaired constantly by carpenters to keep them moving. At the fortress site, the stones were unloaded, shaped, and carried upward, each step part of a cycle that stretched without end. The towers, too, advanced slowly. Their walls were thicker than a man was tall, their stairs spiraling upward in tight circles that demanded precision. Masons cut narrow slits into the stone for arrows, aligning them so that defenders could see far but remain hidden. The work was delicate in detail but repetitive in process. The same measurements taken over and over, the same chiseling and setting repeated, until hands grew calloused and arms weary. Gatehouses required even greater care, for their strength determined whether the fortress could withstand a siege. Builders carved grooves for the portcullis, fitted timbers into iron bands, and created openings above the entrance where stones or boiling liquids could be poured. Each piece was shaped and tested, then adjusted, a process that consumed weeks for what would seem to outsiders like a simple doorway. Inside the walls, the fortress filled with structures that supported daily life. The granaries were lined with stone to guard against dampness and rats. The wells were deepened until water could be reached even during drought, and the kitchens grew with broad hearths that could feed hundreds of men. Chapels rose with modest beauty, their stones carved with care by the same hands that built the battlements, for even in a place of war, faith was considered essential. Barracks stretched along the sides, simple at first, more permanent later, their roofs sloping to shed rain and their walls lined with straw for sleeping soldiers. In the yards, smithies rang with the sound of hammers as weapons were forged, while stables filled with the smell of hay and horses. Every detail added to the fortress required its own cycle of labor, each as slow and deliberate as the last. Beyond the walls, ditches widened and slopes steepened, the land shaped by spades and carts until it became part of the defense itself. Workers dug endlessly, moving earth from one place to another, carving moats where water would stand, piling banks higher so that walls appeared taller still. It was work that consumed entire seasons, for the earth yielded only to persistence, and persistence was the one resource always available. Communities around the site continued to grow, drawn by the steady demand for labor. Markets supplied bread, meat, and ale to the workers, while families settled in huts and cottages nearby. Their lives intertwined with the slow birth of the fortress. Children carried water or fetched tools, women sold food or tended fires, and together they formed a rhythm of life that mirrored the rhythm of construction. Yet for all its bustle, the sense of monotony never disappeared. The workers rose at dawn, labored until dusk, and collapsed into rest, only to repeat the same cycle the next day. Years passed in this manner, and for those who lived within it, time seemed less like a river and more like a wheel, turning endlessly with no clear beginning or end. Accidents remained frequent, and each loss was absorbed into the rhythm without pause. A scaffold might break, a stone might slip, and a man might fall, yet the work pressed on, for the fortress was greater than any single life. The names of the fallen faded quickly, but their labor remained within the stones, silent and enduring. To walk today among the ruins or preserved castles of that age is to sense not only the presence of lords and knights, but also the invisible weight of countless ordinary lives. The fortress stands as their monument, a structure born not of brilliance, but of patience, not of sudden achievement, but of years upon years of steady, repetitive toil, a rhythm carved forever into the stones that still endure. As the fortress neared greater completion, its walls now high enough to cast long shadows across the surrounding land, the rhythm of construction remained unchanged, a steady flow of repetition that shaped both stone and the lives of those who labored upon it. The masons still chipped away at blocks, their hammers rising and falling with the same familiar rhythm, the sound echoing against the half-built towers. Carpenters still sawed and hammered, raising scaffolds only to dismantle them and raise them again as the walls crept higher. Blacksmiths still struck iron upon anvil, producing the endless nails, hinges, and brackets needed for gates, portcullises, and wooden beams. Laborers still trudged under loads of stone and buckets of mortar, climbing ladders with bodies bent to their task, repeating the same cycle each day until the movements felt more like instinct than choice. The fortress grew slowly but surely, its outline taking the shape of permanence. The battlements began to form at the top of the walls, crenellations rising like teeth in a crown, each one requiring precise placement to ensure both strength and alignment. Walkways were added behind them, wooden at first, later reinforced with stone so that guards could patrol in steady circuits. Towers gained their upper levels, their spiral staircases twisting upward in narrow curves, arrow slits cut at measured intervals to provide fields of vision across the land. The gatehouse became a massive structure in its own right, strengthened with layers of timber and iron, grooves carved deep for the portcullis, and openings above prepared for defense. Each piece of this work demanded weeks of careful effort, yet progress remained slow and deliberate, measured not in sudden changes but in steady inches. Inside the fortress walls, life also took form. Kitchens now had large hearths where bread could be baked for dozens at once, Granaries with thick stone walls promised safe storage for years of harvest, and chapels rose with their modest towers, their bells one day to call both soldiers and workers to prayer. Barracks lined the courtyards, filled with rows of wooden bunks, straw spread upon the floors for sleeping men. Stables stood ready for horses, their roofs low and practical, their walls thick enough to shield against the cold. Wells had been dug so deep that water could be drawn even during drought, ensuring that the fortress would endure not only in battle, but also in times of peace. Outside the walls, the defensive landscape hardened. The ditches dug at the start widened into trenches steep enough to slow any attacker. Earth mounds piled higher until they formed natural barriers. In some cases, moats filled with diverted river water glistened under the sun, while in others, the ditches remained dry, their depth alone a weapon. Paths leading to the gate were deliberately angled, forcing approach into narrow spaces where defenders could easily attack from above. All of this required relentless work. Carts of earth moved one after another, shovels biting into soil, and workers sweating through endless hours. The community around the site continued to swell. Markets flourished, selling bread, ale, meat, and cloth to the builders. Families built huts and cottages nearby, their lives tied to the fortress as much as those of the masons and carpenters. Children learned the rhythms of labor, fetching tools, carrying water, or watching fathers and mothers contribute to the effort. Taverns grew busy with the talk of workers, not of glory or grandeur, but of wages, food, and the weariness of another day. The fortress, though built for war, became the center of a quiet cycle of life. Accidents still happened, for scaffolds were fragile and stones unforgiving. A man might slip, a rope might break, and lives would be lost. Yet each loss was absorbed by the work, the site pressing forward with indifference. Names faded quickly, remembered briefly by comrades, but soon replaced by new hands that carried the load. The fortress was a creation of persistence, not of mercy, and in that persistence lay its strength. For those who labored, the sense of time became blurred. Days, weeks, and years flowed together, marked only by the slow rise of walls, the addition of towers, and the expansion of courtyards. To an outside observer, the transformation seemed remarkable, but for those within it, each step was simply another day's work. And when at last the fortress began to resemble the mighty structure it was intended to be, with walls, towers, and gates standing in their full form, it was not the triumph of kings that had made it so, but the quiet endurance of thousands of hands at repeating the same motions again and again. As the fortress reached a stage where its outer walls and towers stood in recognizable form, the work did not end but shifted into an even more detailed phase, where finishing touches demanded as much patience as the great blocks of stone that had first been laid. The battlements, which had begun as rough outlines, were carefully shaped into alternating crenelles and merlons, those familiar tooth-like projections that gave defenders protection while allowing space to launch arrows or stones. Each had to be measured with care, cut from stone with precision, and set with mortar strong enough to resist both weather and the pressure of battle. Behind them, the walkways were widened and reinforced. Wooden planks replaced gradually with stone pavements so that generations of guards could patrol endlessly without weakening the defenses. Towers, now standing tall, needed their interiors completed. Spiral staircases wound upward. Stone steps worn smooth even before the fortress was finished from the constant climbing of workers. Arrow slits were tested, their angles adjusted so that archers inside could cover approaches from every direction. Wooden floors were laid within, supported by beams forged with iron nails, creating chambers for storage, sleeping, and command. The higher levels often housed bells or signals, so that smoke or fire could warn the countryside in times of danger. These tasks seemed small in scale compared to raising the walls, but they consumed just as much time, for each adjustment required careful labor, repeated endlessly until the structure felt secure. The gatehouse, too, reached its final complexity. The portcullis was raised and lowered countless times to ensure it did not stick, the grooves smoothed with care, and the iron bars tested against strain. Heavy doors were hung, reinforced with bands of metal, and locking mechanisms, shaped by blacksmiths, clanged into place. Above the gates, openings known as murder holes were carved, simple yet effective, allowing defenders to drop stones, hot sand, or boiling water upon intruders. Every detail added layers of security, and every layer demanded weeks of effort. Inside the walls, the fortress continued to fill with the necessities of daily life. Granaries were roofed with slate, their doors fitted tightly to guard against damp air and rodents. Kitchens expanded with larger chimneys, their smoke curling above the fortress like signals of constant labor. The chapel neared completion, its modest stone tower crowned with a simple cross, a place where masons and soldiers alike would one day gather to seek protection, not from walls, but from faith. Barracks were lined with rows of wooden bunks, straw mattresses spread across them, the smell of fresh-cut hay mixing with the dust of stone. Wells, dug deep at great effort, were tested to ensure water flowed clean, even in dry seasons. Each of these spaces served a purpose that would one day make the fortress not merely a stronghold, but a living community. Beyond the walls, defensive earthworks continued to expand. Ditches were lined with stone to prevent collapse, moats widened and deepened, and wooden bridges constructed across them, ready to be pulled up in moments of siege. Roads leading to the fortress were paved in rough cobblestone, forcing attackers to slow their approach while allowing carts and wagons to enter with supplies. All of these features required endless digging, hauling, and shaping, the same repetitive labor that had defined every stage of the project. The workers themselves remained bound to routine. Masons chipped stone from dawn to dusk, their arms repeating the same motions until calluses hardened beyond pain. Carpenters sawed and hammered, scaffolds rising and falling again as details demanded constant access. Blacksmiths sweated before glowing forges, shaping hinges, chains, and nails in an unending stream. Laborers carried, lifted, and hauled until exhaustion silenced their complaints. Accidents continued, scaffolds slipping, stones falling, fires sparking. But the work pressed forward with the same inevitability as time itself. Communities around the site grew larger, their markets thriving on the constant need for food, tools, and clothing. Life itself bent around the fortress, just as the fortress bent slowly into its final form. And through it all, the rhythm of construction never changed, steady and monotonous, echoing like the footsteps of soldiers on patrol. What emerged from this persistence was more than a building. It was a monument to patience, a symbol of endurance, and a reminder that strength was born not from sudden acts, but from the long accumulation of small, repeated efforts carried out by countless hands over countless years. As the fortress approached its later stages of construction, the focus of labor shifted from the massive rising walls to the details that gave the structure its true defensive strength and practical function. And though these details seem small compared to the vast curtain walls and towers, they demanded just as much patience and repetition. The battlements along the wall tops were adjusted and tested, each merlon carefully leveled, each gap measured so that archers and crossbowmen could lean out without exposing themselves. Walkways behind the parapets were paved with stone, and drains were carved so that rain would not pool and weaken the mortar. This stage of work required constant measuring, cutting, and adjusting. And though the progress was visible in new patterns of stone and carved channels, the labor itself felt the same to the men who carried it out. Stone lifted, tools struck, mortar spread, over and over again. Within the towers, carpenters fitted wooden floors, cutting beams to size, lifting them into place with ropes, and hammering them into support ledges carved into the stone. Each floor created a chamber, sometimes used for storage, sometimes for sleeping, sometimes for keeping weapons. Spiral stairs wound upward through narrow spaces, and masons smoothed the steps where rough edges threatened to trip the unwary. Windows and arrow slits were framed with stone arches, their edges chiseled with patient care. Above, the roofs were prepared, often with heavy timbers covered in slate, each tile laid in order, row after row, until the tower seemed sealed against both storm and time. In the courtyards, new buildings appeared one by one. Workshops for smiths clanged with the sound of ironwork, stable roofs were repaired, storehouses gained stronger doors, and the chapel interior was slowly decorated, though the carvings remained simple compared to grand cathedrals, for this was a place of defense as much as faith. Granaries filled with the smell of straw and stone dust, their bins waiting for harvest, and kitchens grew crowded with larger ovens and wider hearths. Even wells, already dug, were strengthened with stone linings and pulley systems, each tested again and again to ensure they would hold during long sieges. Outside the fortress, the landscape was shaped further. Ditches were lined with timber where stone was scarce. Slopes were steepened with spades, and moats were tested by diverting streams into their channels. The bridges across these moats were built to be lifted or destroyed quickly in emergencies, their beams cut carefully to balance strength with flexibility. Roads leading to the gates were laid with stone so that wagons carrying supplies could pass in all seasons, while nearby fields were prepared to support the settlement that inevitably grew around every fortress. Villages expanded, markets thrived, and the hum of daily life merged with the slow rhythm of construction. The work remained dangerous. Scaffolds still collapsed, stones still slipped, and fires still sparked in the forges. Men were injured or killed, and though their loss was mourned briefly, the rhythm of labor continued without pause. The fortress demanded constant effort, and no accident, no setback, was allowed to halt it. Each day began with the same routine: the sun rising over walls half complete, men climbing ladders with tools and buckets, oxen hauling stone carts, and women carrying water and food to fuel the endless work. Each day ended with exhaustion, workers resting in cottages or tents, their sleep filled with the same sounds they had heard all day: the ring of iron, the scrape of stone, the creak of wood. Time itself seemed to vanish in this repetition, and the years passed almost unnoticed. For those who labored, the sense of accomplishment was not in dramatic changes, but in the slow certainty that the walls grew higher, the towers stronger, and the gates heavier with every passing season. And when at last the fortress began to look complete, its silhouette dominating the horizon, its towers visible for miles, it stood as the result not of sudden inspiration or bursts of genius, but of the monotonous persistence of thousands of hands, repeating simple actions day after day, year after year, until stone had become something greater than stone, until labor had become legacy. As the fortress neared its final form, the work no longer carried the excitement of new beginnings, but instead settled into the long, patient rhythm of refinement, where every surface, corner, and passage was adjusted, tested, and completed in the same slow and methodical manner that had defined all the years before. The walls stood tall, yet they needed constant finishing. Mortar was checked and replaced where it had cracked. Stones were realigned where weight had shifted, and drains were cleared so that water would not weaken the base. Battlements were sharpened into their final shapes, their crenellations evenly spaced, their parapets lined with coping stones cut to resist erosion. Each adjustment was small, but each required days of steady work. The same motions repeated again and again until perfection was achieved through sheer persistence. Within the towers, the chambers took their final form. Wooden beams were smoothed and floors reinforced, trapdoors fitted so that goods could be raised or lowered, and iron hinges forged by blacksmiths were hammered into place with steady rhythm. The spiral stairs were tested step by step, and stones that felt uneven were recut or replaced, a slow process that consumed weeks for something that might never be noticed by those who used them. Arrow slits were widened or narrowed depending on the angle of view, each adjustment measured carefully so that defenders would one day be able to cover every approach without exposing themselves. The towers gained roofs of slate or tile, each piece placed one after the other in endless rows until the surface was sealed against weather. Inside the walls, the fortress's inner life settled into structure. The chapel stood completed, its bell ready to toll, its interior plain yet solid, its altar carved with care by the same masons who had shaped the battlements. The kitchens were stocked with tools of iron and copper, the forges of the smithy glowed with steady heat, and the granaries echoed with the hollow sound of empty bins waiting for harvest. The barracks filled with wooden bunks lined in straw, each simple and functional, each built with the knowledge that they would be occupied for generations. Wells stood deep and secure, their stones damp and dark, their pulleys tested until they moved smoothly under strain. Outside, the defenses stretched outward into the land. Ditches were deepened, slopes carved sharper, and moats widened until the reflection of the fortress itself shone upon the water. Bridges across these moats were tested repeatedly, lifted and lowered, raised and destroyed, rebuilt again. The same simple motions practiced until every soldier in the garrison would know them by instinct. The roads to the gate were paved in heavier stone, laid piece by piece until carts could pass without sinking, their ruts smoothed and filled again after each season's use. Even as the fortress seemed finished, the work never truly stopped. Weather wore its stone, wood rotted and iron rusted, demanding constant repair. Masons continued to patch walls, carpenters continued to replace beams, and blacksmiths continued to forge new fittings. The fortress was alive in this way, not only as a building, but as a cycle of labor that repeated across generations. Communities around the site thrived, their markets full, their inns crowded, their daily life tied to the presence of the fortress and the security it promised. Children who had once carried water now worked as apprentices, learning the same slow skills that their fathers and grandfathers had practiced. Women kept fires burning and sold bread and ale to the workers, their voices blending with the steady sounds of stone and iron. And always the rhythm continued, not loud or sudden, but constant, like the beat of a drum carried through time. The fortress, once a vision on a parchment plan, now stood as reality, yet its creation remained less a story of brilliance than a story of endurance. It was built through countless small acts repeated endlessly, a hammer striking stone, a rope pulling weight, a shovel biting earth. Each act forgotten, each worker anonymous, yet together they formed something that would endure for centuries. To walk within its walls was to walk among years of labor compressed into stone, a monument not only to the lords who commanded its making, but to the persistence of the human hands that carried it into being. When at last the fortress stood in its completed form, it appeared to rise out of the earth itself, its walls thick and unyielding, its towers high and watchful, its gates heavy with iron and timber. Yet behind that image of strength was not a single act of brilliance, but the slow accumulation of countless small labors carried out over years and generations. The final stages of work were less dramatic than the laying of foundations or the raising of towers, but they were no less necessary. Walls were inspected again and again, mortar patched where cracks appeared, drains cleared so that water would not pool, and coping stones smoothed to resist the wearing of wind and rain. Battlements were tested by guards walking their length, each step sounding against the new paving stones that lined the walkways. Towers echoed with the sound of carpenters fitting doors to chambers, masons adjusting stone arches, and blacksmiths fixing latches, chains, and locks. The gatehouse, already formidable, received its last reinforcements, its portcullis raised and lowered in endless practice, its doors slammed shut and barred, its murder holes tested for angle and reach. Nothing was left to chance, for a fortress was meant to endure not just years, but centuries. In this, the life of the fortress took its final form. Kitchens smoked with the first fires lit in their wide hearths, granaries filled with grain from nearby fields, chapels rang with the soft toll of bells, and wells echoed with the splash of buckets drawing water. Barracks were lined with bunks ready for soldiers, stables stocked with hay for horses, and storehouses stacked with tools and weapons. Everything was functional, plain, and built for endurance rather than beauty, yet together it created a living world within the walls, a place prepared for siege, for safety, and for permanence. Beyond the walls, the defenses hardened into their lasting state. Ditches were widened until they formed true obstacles, moats filled with water diverted from streams, their surfaces rippling beneath the reflection of the fortress walls. Bridges were pulled up and lowered again in drills, soldiers learning the rhythm of defense, their movements becoming part of the fortress itself. Roads leading to the gates were smoothed with stone so that carts could carry supplies year after year, their ruts repaired as quickly as they formed. The landscape that had once been open fields was now reshaped into slopes, banks, and trenches, each designed not for beauty, but for security. The community that had grown around the fortress became permanent as well. Markets thrived in the shadow of the walls, inns and taverns filled with merchants and travelers, and families settled in houses built of wood and stone. The fortress, once only a plan upon parchment, now anchored an entire way of life. Yet even in completion, the work did not end. Stone cracked, wood rotted, iron rusted, and so repairs became as constant as construction had once been. Masons patched walls, carpenters replaced beams, blacksmiths reforged broken fittings, and laborers carried loads just as they had done from the beginning. The fortress was not a finished object but a living presence, demanding attention across the centuries, shaped not only by those who built it, but by those who maintained it. To see it complete was to see the weight of patience, the persistence of repetition, and the endurance of human labor carved into stone. Those who built it rarely saw glory, their names forgotten, their lives spent in cycles of toil. Yet their work endured in walls that stood long after they were gone. The lords who commanded the building might be remembered in chronicles, but it was the anonymous thousands who gave the fortress its reality. Every stone set, every cart hauled, every hammer strike left a trace that could still be felt centuries later. And so the story of medieval fortifications is not one of sudden invention, but of slow persistence, of generations bound by routine, of lives measured not in victories, but in the steady rhythm of labor. The castles and strongholds that still rise across hills and valleys today remain as silent monuments to that endurance, reminders that the greatest achievements of the Middle Ages were not moments of brilliance, but the unending patience of countless hands repeating simple tasks until permanence itself was built from stone. Before we close tonight, remember this simple thought. Restful sleep begins with gentle habits. Try not to go to bed with a heavy stomach, avoid the bright glow of your phone too close to bedtime, and allow your mind to let go of tomorrow's worries. Even small changes can bring you calmer nights and lighter mornings. Thank you for choosing to spend this quiet time with us. Sweet dreams, and we'll see you again tomorrow night at Sleep Whisper.